Awesome. Hello, everyone. We are happy for you to join us today and to start our first series of the spring semester with Dr. Jonas Jägermeyr from Columbia University and NASA. He is a climate change scientist and a crop modeler. He studies food system and global food security at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, the Earth Institute at Columbia University, and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. So today he will join us from New York City and tell about some recent trends in climate change and how they apply to modeling.
So what I'm going to do is, so usually I'm, presenting recent research and talking to colleagues and really discussing details. And I'll do that later too, but I thought it's more fun to zoom out a little bit and give you some context where I see this work comes from and why it is relevant and what's the larger context and all of that. And then, zoom into the nitty-gritty details and actually tell you what the latest research is. So I will start off with some background on sustainable development goals and planetary boundaries. And for maybe 20 minutes, I guess, 15, 20 minutes, and then look at some other work and probably speak about 45 minutes. And we can have it in an interactive way, but you can also collect questions and then we address them after, which whatever you prefer. So yeah, why this zoom out? I want to give you some background and context why the food system is so important in questions related to global sustainability and then climate change after all. There's a lot of pressure on the food production system, and historically seen, humanity was able to push boundaries to invent a series of inventions that helped produce more food and allow a higher carrying capacity, a higher number of people on this planet. And it started off with the Neolithic revolution 10,000 years ago, when people invented farming. With the switch from foraging to farming, domesticating plants and animals, humanity settled down and started that human race for food. Then we invented irrigation, fertilizers. In the Green Revolution in the 60s, we came up with new crop varieties. Industrial Revolution, we keep pushing boundaries. And so far, we got away with it. In the 60s, big questions, limits to growth, Club of Rome, the population bomb, was the big theme. But we proved wrong. We proved them wrong. We got away with it. We constantly keep pushing boundaries, providing more food for more people on the planet, becoming more efficient. Now, that whole theme, this worldview, neglects that this intensification comes at the cost of the ecosystem. So we have negative externalities that aren't priced in or entirely neglected. And the question is, what's next? Where do we go next? What's the next revolution? And as we all know, it has to be a sustainability revolution. Things need to be more in line with our natural resources at hand. And one example for that overdraft, for the negative externalities, is water. Agriculture is one of the largest water users, or is the largest water user on the planet. And here, as an example of irrigated area that substantially increased over the last 100 years from about 60 million hectares to more than 300 million hectares now, goes along with water use for all sorts of reasons, industry, households, but most importantly, irrigation. water withdrawal to put it in the field to grow plants, crops. And that kind of water withdrawal has fundamental implications for the global water system. We're now appropriating more than half of accessible freshwater uses for human needs. 25% of rivers don't reach the ocean anymore. Here's one of the most dramatic examples, the Aral Sea area shrinking to a fraction of its original extent for human water withdrawals. And we are pushing this to a level where it becomes relevant at the global level. So regional processes, regional human interference pushes environmental processes to the level where they compromise Earth system processes. And we call that planetary boundaries. I have these videos here. Let me just move them away. We call them planetary boundaries, or the space they delineate the safe operating space for humanity. This is a popular concept introduced in 2009, triggering a lot of research. Basically, we're combining 9 different biophysical thresholds for water use, climate change, land use, listed here, and delineate a threshold where we think if we go beyond, it will have critical implications for the Earth system in general. And when we want to follow this water example, we see that water is still, this little green wedge here is still below any critical threshold at the global level. But as we have seen and will see in a bit, regionally, a lot of thresholds and boundaries and guidelines are breached, transgressed already. So let's follow this example a little bit and just sketch out what this means in a more abstract thinking experiment. So we have the PB, the planetary boundary for water at the one hand. We are going straight for it, even though maybe not yet breached at global level, but we're doing our best to get there. And then with the introduction of the Sustainable Development Goals, we're also introducing a social boundary, a social foundation. So that means we're, at the same time, while we want to respect environmental limits, we want to make sure people have their rights to food. We want to eradicate hunger and all sorts of other things. So we link a social boundary with environmental boundaries. And in doing so, we create the subspace that we call a safe and just space, where we kind of want to steer to. But that's a non-trivial thing and it's complex. So that's why we're here talking about sustainable intensification. With the introduction of the SDGs, it was kind of a big deal because it was for the first time that environmental integrity was legally acknowledged as a foundation for long-term societal and economic development. Combining all these in one framework is a pretty big deal, ratified by all nations in the United Nations. Now, if we want to, oh yeah, and then food and water, where we're talking about here, is right at the heart of this whole concept and framework. So if you want to look at this a little bit in detail, you know, the different targets, what they call it, in the SDG 2, eradicate hunger, you know, double agricultural productivity, sustainable and resilient food production, and hunger. If we want to combine these with the target with SDG 6, with targets of sustainable withdrawals, protect water systems. We are creating this subspace, these interactions that turn out to be pretty non-trivial and a pretty complex equation we're aligning here, which require some sort of thinking. One way to get around this is to use modeling. So there's a big community. We've developed global hydrological models, crop models, and sort of things where we can address complex questions, develop pathways, how things could change in the future. And here's one example, a model that we're developing at the Potsdam Institute in Germany, here at NASA and Columbia University in New York, which is a hybrid model. It can simulate water flows, it can simulate crop growth, but also natural vegetation. And we're trying to disentangle and address some of these complex interactions to just highlight what a sustainable pathway could look like. And just as an example, if we look at water withdrawal, in these cells that are colored in orange and red, we currently have an overdraft. So humanity is using more water than it should, and it happens at the cost of the ecosystem. And in some areas in Central Asia and South Asia and Western United States, these withdrawals are pretty substantial. Now we can use a model to try translate these withdrawals in okay, hold on, here's one point. So if we want to quantify these overdrafts, we learn that about 40% of global irrigation water use is unsustainable and at the expense of environmental flow requirements, or in other words, the ecosystem. Now, if you want to translate this in food production, we can ask, okay, what happens if we maintain these flow requirements and safeguard the ecosystem if we implemented rigorous policies to stop using too much water? And that's what we see here. If we maintained all the water in the rivers needed, current food production would decline in many areas by more than 20%, 30%, and at global level, by more than 20% of what we currently produce total food production. That's a pretty substantial number. And obviously, we can't just do that. At the same time, we have a portfolio of sustainable intensification measures at hand. So there's a whole bunch of things we can do to change our current food system or our current farming practices in a more sustainable way. These include irrigation transitions. Irrigation, as said, is the biggest water user globally, using 70% of global freshwater use, and is often very inefficient. So a bunch of water is just dumped on the field, evaporates, drains, or just runs off. And with a transition to higher efficient systems, we can, in fact, spare a lot of water and use it for other uses. As important and often overlooked are measures in rainfed farming systems. And these include leaving organic mulching, plastic mulching films on the field to alleviate soil moisture, but also combining different farming practices. Here we call it agroforestry, combining trees and field crops and just using beneficially mutually beneficial setups to use water more efficiently. And then obviously water harvesting is important, where we collect rainwater from across different scales, from small scale farmer, from the rooftop to more industrial sized systems, to use rainwater during dry spells and help grow crops. So, there's different processes here. Water comes down as rain or irrigation, and then there's seepage and runoff, and then transpiration is the important part. We want to use the water more efficiently to grow more crops. So the whole idea is to shift and reduce losses associated with evaporation, surface runoff, and make it available for crop transpiration. And as of now, only 40% of the water used in global agriculture is actually used in a productive way. So it's a huge body of water that's just being lost in the system, and there's a lot that can be done. And in fact, if you want to combine all of this in a scenario that's we call an ambitious transition, where we combine shifts in irrigation and rain-fed water and soil management, we can indeed increase current food production by substantial amounts in many regions, by 50%, at global level, by over 40%, if we wanted to use water more efficiently without any additional other inputs. We're not expanding our land, we're not using any additional fertilizer or doing anything else. We're just using the water that is available right now in a more efficient way. And obviously, these are modeling results that are based on simplified theoretical assumptions run in a computer model, but they help us identify large untapped potentials that we can then go ahead and refine in local case studies and use for awareness building and raising attention, and just say, look, here's substantial potential that's currently overlooked. So let's go ahead and try to work our way this way. And then kind of like my final note to close this chapter on the larger context is in view of the initial human race for food, we shouldn't wait for the next technical revolution for lab-grown meat and hyper efficient crop varieties that can withstand droughts and heat waves. It's an implementation challenge in the first place. We have the knowledge, we can change current farming practices to a large extent. And while we're talking about all of this, we should just go ahead and do it and not just sit back and wait for the next technological revolution. All right, so that's kind of my pitch. Now I want to shift gears and actually talk about some recent science, some a study that we published recently. But maybe to breathe for a second, if you have immediate questions, maybe now is a good time to come forward. I actually don't know if in the webinar participants can actually speak up, or if that's only the chat.
They're supposed to write in the chat, yes, but they haven't typed anything yet. So I don't think they can speak up unless I give them permission to do that, but they can write in the chat.
Okay.
So no questions yet.
Oh, here's the chat. I see. Okay. I have a question about the second to last slide.
Oh, I don't see that one. How do you see that?
Yeah, don't be shy. Type, hammer in some questions, grill me. That's fun. But since there is no critical understanding questions or something like that, let me just go. And then in the end, we can go back to specific slides and specific questions, if that's cool. But if there's something urgent, you can always stop me. And cool. So one thing we've neglected in the last 20 minutes is climate change, right? So climate change comes in and makes things quite a bit more complicated. So in the last couple of years, we spent much of our time to understand what climate change is actually going to do with our current food production systems. And then all of that needs to be seen in the larger context of the global sustainability that I just pitched. So, okay, to get started with this, here's an animation of the latest state-of-the-art multi-model ensemble estimates of future crop responses to climate change. So it's a time series of maize and wheat yield changes by the end of the century. And we already see now mid-century in the 70s and then towards the end of the century, pretty dramatic changes associated with climate change. Much of wheat is going to, or is indicated to see gains in higher latitudes, and maize on the other side, or corn on the other side, sees dramatic negative responses. Before we go there and what it means and how we derive these kind of numbers, I want to step a little back and now introduce AGMAT. So all of these future projections, how we call it, we are not talking about forecasts or predictions. You know, a weather forecast can make a prediction for the next 3 days, but when we talk about estimates by the end of the century, we're really talking about projections or outlooks or estimates or something, because uncertainty is very large. And in fact, uncertainty is so large in these different models that we started to combine them. Now we don't use individual models to make a statement. We're using multi-model ensembles, combining 5, 10, 15, 20 models, and then use the average or the mean or the median of these models to make a more robust, more informed decision. And around that idea, we started AGMAT, the Agricultural Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project, which combines more than 1,000 scientists all over the world, stakeholders, crop modelers, climate scientists, farmers on the field. So we're trying to integrate different perspectives and different methodologies to, have a community that can address these questions in a more robust way. So we're lifting this to the next level. And just as of now, we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of AGMAT. Unfortunately, this is in lockdown, so we got to have our party at some point. But it's a thing. And in AGMAT, we have a ton of different initiatives. I'm not going to explain all of them, but it goes from global economics modeling to really local experimental stuff on the field. And one initiative is AgGrid, or the Global Crop Model Intercomparison Project, that I lead along with Christoph Miller at the Potsdam Institute. So I'm going to speak a little bit about what we can do at the global level with these global models and climate change. And then on the other side, there is ECMAP, yet another MIP, a model intercomparison project, which is, kind of a flashy thing right now. But the ECMIP is a cross-sectoral model intercomparison. So what we do in AGMAP on the left side feeds into the agricultural sector in ECMIP, and then we contextualize it with other sectors. There's health, there's water, there's energy, there's a whole series of different sectors that all try to harmonize their approaches, use the same inputs, the same assumptions, so we can compare and really improve our understanding what our findings mean across the board, and improve the robustness of what we're talking about. So there's kind of like a mutual connection between the both, and this is for your context. So I guess by now you kind of like figured these models are large scale computer simulations that run at supercomputers at our big institutes, and whole teams develop these things over years' time. We have certain inputs, climate models or reanalysis, weather products provide the inputs, and then we have basically 3 main user groups or output products. You know, we're doing our own studies and impact assessments, adaptation potential, attribution studies, all related to climate change. Then our outputs feed into the ag econ community. So crop yield changes will be used in integrated assessment models and economic models that then figure out what food prices might look like, how land use patterns might change in the future. All of that is done in the ag econ community. And then we also work on seasonal forecasting and early warning systems. So we're not only interested what happens in 50 years into the future, but more and more it becomes important to understand what's the short-term outlook by the end of the season, or maybe within the next 5 years, right? You can imagine that a farmer is more interested in what's happening right now than, or an insurance company, what's happening right now than in 50 plus years. So this is just a little bit of background what this all does. In GGCMI, you know, I'm just going to use this little mouthful of an acronym. We had different phases and simulation rounds. In 2014, that was kind of like the first time we put these models together in a harmonized way, used the same inputs, and that was used for the IPCC 5th assessment report. And the main conclusion from this exercise was, look, the crop models or impact models actually introduce more uncertainty than the climate models itself. We're using climate models as our inputs, but it's us that is the really uncertain part, and the models just go way different routes. So that was important to learn, but it also meant that we have a lot of homework to do. And then in following years, we did reanalysis exercises. So we used a whole bunch of historical weather data sets, just running the past 40 years and trying to improve and understand the models and, you know, have them speak the same language before we go ahead and then improve future projections. In another exercise 2 years ago, we created a multi-dimensional response surface where we ran the models for a perturbation of different climate variables. So we say, okay, what happens if temperature drops by 1 degree, increases by 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 degrees? What happens if precipitation changes? You know, and then we have kind of like a surface, a lookup table, if you want, just terabytes of data that we can then train emulators on and can really fast and lightweight responses that we can then run in hundreds and thousands of simulations without really the need to run these heavy crop models that run on supercomputers. This stuff might be a little bit beyond what we should talk about here, but there's a wealth of data that we can use in all sorts of different applications. And I think I have one slide that gives you a nice example where this can go, but I'll stop here with the super technical part. And then this is what we're actually here for. Now we're in GGCMI phase 3, where we now run the latest generation of climate models. That's called CMIP 6. So CMIP, you see another MIP, is the model intercomparison of climate models, latest generation, released just recently. This was also the stuff that was in the IPCC report that was released in last year. And now we use that new climate model archive in new generation of crop models that will be featured in the working group 2 IPCC that's going to be presented February 27th, I think, in just about a month. Okay, here as promised, let me see if this should actually be live. So this is pretty neat. It's called our AGMAT Impacts Explorer. And that's based on this multidimensional response surface. And if I lost you there, I hope I can get you back here, because you just have these interactive sliders and can say, okay, what happens if temperature increases by a degree? And what happens if precipitation decreases by 10% or 20%? And oh, let's increase our CO2 concentration a little bit and maybe drop our fertilizer application. You know, it's right at your fingertip. It's global, and you have the response surface for all sorts of different settings for different crops. And that's a pretty neat thing, because you can go ahead and, you know, run thousands of simulations and get the response within a second, and not waiting for months for the computer simulations to finish. All right. Okay. Let's skip that. We did a study on nuclear conflict. That's interesting, but and some pretty dramatic results. But if you're really interested, we talk about it offline, and we jump to the climate change stuff. So this is a paper we just recently published that is kind of like the new reference in global process-based crop simulations. And we had three main findings. One is the title, climate change impacts and the emergence occurs earlier in the new generation of climate models, climate and crop models. And let me just walk you through the three main findings. And this is now the forefront of the field of what we in the crop modeling community do. So this is actually happening right now. So the first finding is the crop responses to climate change are more pronounced than previously thought. And by pronounced, I mean that for some crops, they are much more pessimistic or negative. And then for other crops, they're more optimistic. So the signal is stronger. And here we look at maize responses. Excuse if I use maize, we don't say corn at the international community, for two different scenarios. So that's in climate scenario SSP 1 and the RCP 2.6. And here's the RCP 8.5. I don't know if I overwhelm you with these acronyms, but it's just two different emission pathways. One high mitigation pathway that's in line with the Paris Agreement, and one high emission pathway that's more of a business as usual, actually the high end. Now people go away from this and say this is actually pretty bad. But it kind of like spans the potential range of future outcomes, the most positive and the most negative, basically. And interestingly, the dashed line shows the different climate models, the range of the different climate models, and the solid vertical line shows the different crop models, right? So, and you immediately see the range of crop models is wider than the range of climate models for the high emission scenario. For the lower case, they're pretty equal, which is good. But here we see the crop models introduce a lot of uncertainty. And that's basically what I'm talking about, the homework we have to do. We have to reduce this range in order to get a more robust understanding. This is, however, where the field stands. This is the latest estimates of the most state-of-the-art, most advanced crop models. And we compare it with the stuff that was based on CMIP 5. If you remember these timeline plots with the blue-orange map at the top where I said this is the first time we did this kind of exercise, this is the data here. This is GGCMI CMIP 5 in 2014, and the average maize response was plus 1% under the worst case climate scenario. So now our latest estimates for the worst case climate scenario based on new crop models and new climate models is minus 24%. So there's a substantial shift in our own community just within a couple of years. We moved from, oh, it doesn't really matter, to, whoa, this is actually pretty substantial. And this is a big eye-opener that climate change does indeed has a profound influence on future crop growth. Now for wheat, as said, our estimates improved. So the yield levels projected out in the future increased from about 10% to 17%. And for the other crops we simulate, soybean and rice, both see a substantial shift to more neutral or more negative responses. But we need to see that soybean and rice are highly uncertain. You see the range goes across the zero line by far, and we shouldn't make big conclusions about these crops, at least at the global level. Regionally, we're more confident in our results. And then the other thing I want to highlight is the time of emergence theme. We call it the time of climate impact emergence, TCIE, which points out that the point in time when an average response leaves the historical range of uncertainty and variability. We call it noise. So, and that's important because now we start looking at this question from a risk perspective. We're not just saying, okay, things are changing on average by X%, but these X% can mean very different things in different location and in a different context. So we're comparing a mean change with the range of historical variability. And that's a new concept. It hasn't been introduced in the impact community or the ag science community. So it's a new way to look at things. And we actually show that the time of emergence occurs much earlier than previously thought or expected. So again, we compare the GGCMI CMIP 5 with the GGCMI CMIP 6, and we now find that these emergence dates are actually around the corner. So for maize, under the business as usual case, it's in 10 years. For wheat, on the other side, we see an increase in yield, but we can also calculate an emergence time of that change. And that's actually really just happening right now, next year and within the next couple of years. And that's an alarming signal that hasn't been known before. I spare you this one, but I want to point out that the extent of these emergence signal changes are more widespread than previously expected. So here is a global map indicating the time, the year, when the signal becomes an emergent signal. So when the signal becomes greater than the noise of the background variability. And what we see is that in most global maize growing areas, we do see that signal to happen sooner or later. In some areas pretty soon, in other areas maybe a little later. But if we wanted to accumulate the area, the total area of maize cultivation that sees an emergent signal, by the end of the century, we are at 74%. So 3/4 of total global maize growing areas will see a substantial shift in their climatic risk profile. And that's substantially higher than CMIP 5 based previous crop model ensembles indicated. Last point on this one, even under the high mitigation pathway in line with the Paris Agreement, we do see substantial areas that are facing these kind of changes. So that means we don't have a lot of room for mitigation because this is basically happening whatever we do. Here's another animation by the NASA NEOS team, basically showing the same thing. But I like it because it shows how the creeping changes comes over time and then really intensifies by the end of the century. And when looking at these kind of data, the emergence signal at grid cell level will be later than, say, at global level, because at global level we average the background variability. So there's the historical range is smaller, so the change signal occurs earlier than at very fine scaled data points. Here I just wanted to say that we are not just a single data point out there stipulating something. The findings we show is actually rooted in the climate sciences. So here is an example of temperature emergence, and they basically find the same time that, you know, in very short time periods, the temperature signal is emerging from the historical variability with mean time estimates between 2020 and 2030 in many world regions. And for precipitation, it's the same thing. In orange, we see areas that already see that kind of emergence signal happening today. Really quick, the third big finding, and that's not really new, but it is important, is the geographical patterns of change. And in this figure, we see a latitudinal gradient of crop yield changes averaged as latitudinal bands. And what it highlights is that negative changes are most prominent in the lower latitudes, in the tropical regions. And at higher latitudes, we actually see some gains. And that's the same thing for all other crops. So the lower latitudes will see largest losses. For rice, this figure doesn't really work because there's patches that cancel out each other. But overall, the theme is the same thing, that a warming will lead or can allow potential gains at higher latitudes, where cultivation is currently temperature limited, and an additional warming will push crop processes to their critical levels at lower latitudes. And it is a problem because our nations are differently developed, and more developed countries happen to be at higher latitudes. And when we talk about tropical, subtropical countries, we often have self-sufficiency environments where crop losses directly feed into livelihood implications and affect food security. And IPCC has a framing for that, a reason for concern. And the disproportionate effect of climate change on crop yields globally is, in IPCC language, a reason for concern. Now, looking at the time, I probably threw already a lot at you, but the immediate next question is, okay, why is that the new simulations are so much more pronounced and so different? Please bear with me. I'm not going to go through all of this. I'm just highlight the three main themes. CMIP 6, the new climate models, are much warmer than CMIP 5, and especially over cropland. So warmer means more climate change, which is very important for crops. The second topic is the crop models have changed. So the new crop models, there's more crop models, and all the other crop models have advanced and are scrutinized and developed, but they're more sensitive. So they react more to warming, but we also have more warming. So there's a double burden. And here you see in blue the previous one, and in red the new ones, -12 versus -30, just as the temperature response. And that's a substantial change attributed to more warming and more sensitive models. And the third point is CO2. So I don't know if you're aware, but carbon dioxide concentration in the air is actually beneficial for crop growth. It amplifies photosynthesis and helps crops grow faster. But it also has negative effects on nutrient content. I'm not going to talk about this here, but CO2 is one of the most sensitive factors in crop yield simulations. And in CMIP6, the CO2 concentrations are much higher. So these have big implications, and the crop models are slightly less sensitive. So there's a somewhat of a balancing effect here. To end this, the next thing you can ask, okay, we have these two ensembles, one is more sensitive, which one is better? Fair. CMIP6 is somewhat debated. People say we don't trust the new temperature sensitivities, and there's something to it. So we're not saying that CMIP6 is better than CMIP5. We kind of like see it as a complement, and it's worthwhile studying both. But we are sensitive to potential implications, so we want to learn from it. The other more important thing here is that the crop models have advanced. And I don't know if this goes beyond what we should discuss here, but if we want to break down uncertainty, we can look at variance. Variance induced by the crop models, GGCMs, and variance induced by the GCMs. You basically say, okay, here, 97% of the uncertainty comes from the crop models, and only 3% of the uncertainty comes from the climate models, right? So that was in CMIP5. So virtually all of the uncertainty is attributed to the crop models, which is not cool. Now in the new ensemble, we still have the crop models dominate this picture. 70% is from the crop models, but it is a more balanced outcome. So the climate model uncertainty became bigger and the crop model uncertainty became smaller, so that they are more consistent. And that's a good thing. And that's consistent for the other crops. So that's why we can say the new crop model ensemble is better than the old one. It's more sensitive and it is more balanced. I'll spare you this one and this one. There's a lot of text here. The message of this slide is we created a very rich data set with a ton of simulations, and we can't write enough papers ourselves. So we are actively inviting participants, guests, research groups to come and collaborate, use our data, and do your own study. So here, a list of external users, all these are people that are already working with these data. And the list is growing. There's already 3 more items on this list as we're speaking. So if you're interested in all of this, please reach out, and I'm more than happy to provide you with the data, and we can collaborate, or you just take the data and do your own study. We are just happy if the data gets used. And to round up conclusions, climate change is more pronounced than thought because of warmer climate models, more sensitive crop models, and higher CO2 levels. We went through that in length. Climate impact emergence, the time when the signal actually becomes visible, is around the corner. In some areas of the world has already happened. And the extent of these changes affect pretty much all breadbasket regions in the world, and they will face these changes in the coming decades, which is important for adaptation metrics to come in place. And I haven't stressed enough that this study isolates the climate signal. So we are deliberately not looking at adaptation measures. We're not changing planting dates, cultivars, doing additional irrigation, or changing land use areas, or switching crops or something like that. We're isolating the climate signal to say this is the fingerprint of climate change, And now we need to go ahead and do adaptation to avoid the most adverse impacts. And then the third finding is that lower latitudes will suffer most, with disproportionate affecting the poor with much smaller adaptation capacity. And then fourth is what I just said, that we're inviting people to come work with us, use the data, and write awesome papers and research studies. If you want to have more details, here's the link to that study, but there's a series of additional studies in the making, in the pipeline, coming out soon.